With Christmas coming up next week, I haven't had a lot of time to devote to making videos for YouTube. So I thought I would take this opportunity to show you guys one way that I use to render fur. There are a lot of ways that you can render fur when it comes to airbrushing. One of the techniques I really like to use most of the time is scratching and erasing, because you can build a lot of layers and bring your highlights back out very easily. In this particular painting, I'm not using scratching and erasing techniques. This is all 100% airbrush. Normally, I prefer to work from light to dark. With this particular method, it requires me to work from the darks to the lights, or the background, and then come forward with your highlights. And that allows you to build more believable layers in the fur. So I'm going to be concentrating pretty much on this area right here of this painting. How I've started it off camera is just to get rid of the white of the actual canvas. As I came in with some Wicked Detail Burnt Sienna, which is the orange color you see, and just kind of fog this area in just to put some color in there to get rid of the white of the canvas again. The darker color that you see in some of these areas is actually Wicked Detail Sepia. So at this point, I'm going to come back in with some sepia and begin building just a little bit of detail, some strands and some shadowed areas in this area. I'm not going full-blown detail. I'm not trying to paint individual hairs. I'm just trying to get some shadows built in, because ultimately this section of this fur is actually going to be very dark and in shadow, a lot like the dark brown shades that you see here. So let's get started. One thing to pay close attention to anytime you're rendering, whether it's hair or fur, is pay attention to your reference and the direction that the hair is going, because our hair and or fur doesn't always flow in a nice uniform direction. You'll have those stray hairs going off in a totally different direction than the rest of the flow and things of that nature. In this case, I didn't have the best reference photograph to work from, so I did wind up using some artistic license in the end. But make sure you pay attention to details like that when you're rendering your hair or your fur. And when you're rendering hair or fur, you want to pick out shapes and try to render more clumps or sections of hair versus individual strands. If you get into the mindset of trying to airbrush each individual strand of hair or fur, your work's going to turn out looking more like spaghetti versus actual hair or fur. We're just going for the look. You don't necessarily have to paint each and every individual strand. You'll want some here and there, but for the most part, I'm painting more clumps or sections of hair. Now I said that I'm not concentrating on painting individual strands of fur. That's true to an extent, up until you get to an edge like I was working on here. At that point I'm starting to use dagger strokes to taper those strokes off and make it look more like they're individual strands and clumps of fur that are ending to the point where you see the background, which was basically a doggy bed that the pet was lying on when the original picture was taken. But in this area here, I was concentrating more on just developing shadows. There are some what looks like it could be strands or clumps of hair in here, but there's nothing really detailed. It's just kind of more of a shadowed area. So at this point, I'm going to come in with a lighter color. It's a color that I mixed up. I took some Wicked Detail Opaque White and put a drop of sepia and a couple drops of the burnt sienna into that mixture, and that gave me a very creamy kind of off-white color. So next we'll come in with that color and I'll start building some of these highlights, and then we'll come back and push those back. And if you've ever wondered why we spend the time we do practicing things like dots, lines, dagger strokes, blends, things of that nature, those are all topics that I haven't covered in videos on this channel yet, but they are coming, and this is why. This painting is literally thousands upon thousands of dagger strokes. The vast majority of this entire painting is nothing but dagger strokes, and that's why we practice. That looks pretty good. Again, at this point, this is not about building detail. We're just building layers of fur. So at this point, this is all very stark in contrast to everything surrounding it. So I'm going to take my original sepia mix, which is just straight out of the Wicked Detail sepia bottle. By the way, it's been reduced with 4011 reducer about 1:1. And I'm going to just fog some sepia over these lighter strands that I just painted in, and that should turn the color closer to this sort of light brown mix that you see in this area here. Again, just fogging the color over it. I'm not trying to paint any more strands or clumps of hair. I'm just going to fog over these lighter strands to change the tone of the color ever so slightly. So just a wash of color is all we're going to do here. There you see I'm using my hand as a freehand shield just to keep overspray off of the eye, which has already been completed. And you can see how that pushed those lighter areas back a little bit further into the background. So at this point I'm going to come in with a Candy 2.0. I'm going to use Dirt Track Brown to do the same thing. Push some of these shadowed areas a little bit further back. Build a little bit more detail, not a lot, just a few more shadowed details. But the advantage of using the Candy 2.0 is the candy will darken the areas that are already existing on the canvas, but it's also 100% transparent, so I don't have to worry about covering any of the detail that we've already built in these layers. So Dirt Track Brown is the next step. And this step is very strategic. I'm not coming in and just blasting this Candy 2.0 color across the surface or painting just a wash. I'm targeting specific areas that I want to darken. Okay, so everything in this section has now been pushed pretty far back. It's all, for the most part, in shadow. At this point, I want to concentrate on bringing back out the highlights, which are pretty much on the left side of this little section. To do that, I'm going to go back to that cream colored mix that we were using just a few minutes ago. And all I'm doing here is using dagger strokes to build additional layers. Sometimes I like to use a freehand shield for some very sharp edges. So one more layer down, and you can see now all that background that we created previously is more in the background, and we've got some strands of fur and some clumps of fur more towards the foreground. So we're working again from back to front in this particular case. But you can still see some of the detail on the strands in the background. So at this point, I want to push these highlights back just a little bit, not quite as far back as we have before. So I'm going to go with the burnt sienna, and again just lightly fog a very light wash of color over these highlights to change the color from this sort of off-white color more to this orangey yellowish color that we have in these areas. So burnt sienna comes up next. This color is also straight out of the bottle. It's just been reduced with 4011 reducer about 1:1. See how I'm using a freehand shield to create some of the shadows, keeping this strand in the foreground and these more in the shadow underneath it. And this is just a very, very light wash. All I'm trying to do is tint this color . And I'll also use this color to come in a little bit darker and start fading some of these lighter wisps of color back into this darker area. Maybe just a few hints this color a little bit darker. In just a few areas, just to play on some of these strands of fur overlapping one another. So hopefully you can see that cream shade that we had just a few minutes ago is a completely different tone now that we've come over the top of that with the burnt sienna. And I'll continue to work this back and forth pretty much until I'm happy with it, but that's the gist of the process. This is one method you can use for painting hair or fur. I'll come back over this again with the cream mixture, probably finer strands to add a few more little highlights, and then once again I will lightly mist, probably even lighter than we did this last time, over the top of that, just to give me some different values in tones of all of this fur. Some of you may be wondering why I'm working on one little section. Why not just paint everything one color to begin with, or work with one color rather than going back and forth cleaning my airbrush out? The reason in my mind is because it just doesn't always work that way. I think it looks better the way that I'm doing it now because some of this fur is overlapping other areas. So I actually started with the ear on the left side, and then I moved on to the top portion of the dog's head, and then I moved into this area because this area is overlapping both the ear and this section, and then I continued to work my way down the left side of her face. And I think it just makes more sense that way. Like this area of fur on her nose is overlapping this darker section here, so it just makes sense sometimes to do it the hard way. If you can figure out a way to paint it using just one color at a time and completely painting the entire portrait, that's great. I don't have a good way to do that. So again, this is just one way you can paint fur. It's not the only way, but it works and it's believable. It's not hyper realistic. I wasn't going for hyper realistic. I just wanted a good pet portrait. This was my daughter's first dog. It was her first pet, and it died suddenly after only a couple years. So that broke her little heart. I wanted to give her something to remind her of her first puppy. So this is going to be my daughter's Christmas present, so I've got to get it done. I'm sorry I've been short on time. I wish I could have put a better tutorial together or had more time to get more in depth, but it is what it is. So I hope you guys have got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio. Merry Christmas to you all, and I will see you next time.